You may believe that cutting off a narcissist completely is enough to protect yourself, but physical distance is only the first layer of freedom. You can block their number, remove them from your social media, delete every message, and never speak to them again. Yet their influence can still remain active in your thoughts. They may be gone from your surroundings while their voice continues playing in your mind. But there is something important you need to understand. You do not have to confront them, expose them, hurt them, or seek revenge to take your power back. There is a psychological shift that can make their influence disappear far more effectively than any angry message ever could. And once you understand that shift, you stop measuring your freedom by whether they react and start measuring it by whether you have stopped reacting internally. Most people think no contact means blocking a number, deleting old conversations, unfollowing someone, and making sure there is absolutely no communication. Those things can be important, especially when continued contact keeps reopening the wound. But they are only the visible part of the process. The deeper battle happens inside your own mind. A narcissistic relationship can leave behind mental patterns that continue operating long after the person is physically absent. You may still replay old conversations and wonder what you should have said differently. You may question whether you were too emotional, too demanding, or too unforgiving. You may feel like you still need to explain yourself or prove that you were not the person who caused everything to fall apart. That is where the real attachment survives. The person may be gone, but the psychological conversation can continue for months or even years if you never challenge it. Think about the doubts that were repeatedly placed inside your mind. Maybe you were made to feel guilty for having reasonable needs. Maybe you learned to apologize simply to restore peace. Maybe you became overly careful because you were constantly anticipating their mood. You may have started believing that keeping someone happy was your responsibility, even when their behavior was hurting you. These patterns can become automatic. You might over-explain when nobody has asked for an explanation. You might apologize when you have done nothing wrong. You might become terrified of disappointing someone because your nervous system learned to associate disagreement with rejection. Even after the relationship ends, those habits can remain. That is why physical separation does not automatically equal psychological freedom. If your decisions are still being shaped by what they might think, how they might react, or whether they would approve, then some part of your life is still organized around them. This is why you can be completely no contact and still feel emotionally connected to the person. You might never send them another message, yet spend hours mentally arguing with them. You might never look at their profile again, yet wonder whether they regret losing you. You might never hear their voice again, yet continue hearing their criticism whenever you make a decision. In that sense, the relationship can continue internally, even when it has ended externally. The goal is not simply to remove the person from your phone. The goal is to remove the psychological position they were given inside your mind. Their approval cannot remain the measurement of your worth. Their interpretation cannot remain the final version of what happened. Their emotional reactions cannot remain something you feel responsible for managing. The moment you begin taking your attention back, you begin taking your power back as well. Your attention is one of the most valuable things you possess, and freedom begins when you stop spending it on someone who no longer deserves access to it. Many people believe they can finally defeat a narcissist by confronting them with everything they did. They imagine one powerful conversation where they expose every lie, describe every betrayal, and finally make the other person understand the damage they caused. But confrontation does not always create the freedom people expect. Sometimes it simply creates another emotional exchange where you become angry, defensive, desperate to be understood, or determined to receive an apology. And all of those reactions keep the connection alive. Even anger can become a form of attachment when your emotional state continues to depend on what the other person did or failed to do. You may think you are proving that they hurt you, but they may simply see your emotional intensity as evidence that they still have significance in your life. Your reaction tells them they still occupy emotional territory that you have not completely reclaimed. This is why dramatic messages, Lengthy explanations, emotional confrontations, and attempts to make them feel guilty often fail to create the result you imagined. The issue is not whether your words are powerful enough. The deeper issue is that you are still trying to make something happen inside them. You want them to understand, you want them to regret it, you want them to recognize what they lost, you want them to finally see you clearly. But all of those desires keep your attention pointed in their direction. True detachment begins when you no longer need a particular reaction from them for your own healing to continue. You do not need them to admit what happened before you can accept what happened. You do not need an apology before you can move forward. You do not need them to understand your pain before you are allowed to stop carrying it. Your closure can exist without their participation. What creates the deepest separation is not pretending that you never cared. It is reaching a point where their behavior no longer controls your emotional state. You are not secretly waiting for them to notice your silence. You are not checking whether they have tried to contact you. You are not posting things hoping they will see how well you are doing. You are not imagining their reaction to your success. You are simply living. That distinction matters because silence can still contain attachment. Someone can remain silent while secretly hoping the other person becomes desperate enough to return. That is not freedom. Real detachment is quieter. You stop performing your healing for them. You stop wondering whether your absence is affecting them. You stop trying to communicate through silence. Your life gradually becomes about you again, rather than becoming a message designed for someone else to interpret. When that happens, the dynamic changes in a profound way. You no longer move toward them hoping to repair something, but you also do not move away from them trying to prove something. You simply stop organizing your emotions around their existence. You do not need to punish them. You do not need to defeat them. You do not need to make them feel what you felt. Their actions become information rather than commands. If they attempt to provoke you, you do not automatically respond. If they attempt to pull you back into an old argument, you do not feel compelled to defend yourself. If they suddenly become charming, emotional, apologetic, or nostalgic, you evaluate their behavior instead of immediately responding to the emotional pull. Your power comes from no longer being automatically controlled by the pattern. That is the real shift. You are no longer allowing another person's behavior to dictate what happens inside you. This is also why genuine indifference is so different from pretending not to care. Pretending requires constant effort because you are still monitoring the person and trying to create a certain impression. Genuine detachment requires less effort because you are no longer participating in the emotional game. You do not need to convince yourself that they are terrible every morning. You do not need to constantly remind yourself how badly they treated you. Eventually, the relationship simply becomes something that happened in your past. You can acknowledge the damage without allowing the damage to become your identity. You can remember what happened without repeatedly reliving it. You can recognize their behavior without spending your entire life analyzing their motives. That is where emotional freedom begins. The person no longer occupies the center of your internal world, and you no longer need their reaction to confirm that you have moved forward. There is another part of this process that is even more important, and it involves the story you tell yourself about what happened. Psychological control often survives because the person has influenced not only how you behaved around them, but also how you interpreted yourself. Over time, you may have absorbed messages that made you question your memory, your intentions, your emotional responses, and your value. You may have been told that you were too sensitive, too demanding, too dramatic, too emotional, or impossible to please. Eventually, those accusations can become an internal voice. Even when the relationship ends, you may automatically question yourself whenever you feel hurt. You may wonder whether you misunderstood everything. You may minimize what happened because you became accustomed to minimizing it while you were still together. This is why changing your internal narrative becomes such an important part of healing. Instead of automatically accepting the version of events you were repeatedly given, you begin examining your own experience with greater honesty. You remember what you felt. You recognize patterns instead of isolated incidents. You stop judging every event separately and start looking at what repeatedly happened over time. Maybe you noticed that you were constantly apologizing while the same behavior kept happening. Maybe you recognized that your concerns were dismissed until you eventually became overwhelmed. Maybe you see that every attempt to establish a boundary somehow became an argument about your character. These realizations can be uncomfortable, but they create clarity. You are no longer asking, "Was I perfect?" because you understand that being imperfect does not make someone deserving of manipulation or emotional mistreatment. You begin asking a more useful question: what pattern was I living inside? That question can change everything. This does not mean convincing yourself that you were flawless or turning the other person into a monster in your mind. Healing does not require exaggeration. It requires accuracy. You can acknowledge your own mistakes while refusing to carry responsibility for someone else's choices. You can admit that you handled certain situations imperfectly without accepting blame for behavior that was never yours to control. You can recognize that relationships are complicated while still recognizing when a repeated pattern became damaging. The goal is not to create a new fantasy where you were always right. The goal is to stop living inside someone else's interpretation of you. When you develop that clarity, you no longer need to defend your worth against every accusation that was once made against you. Their opinion becomes one opinion rather than the final verdict on who you are. And this is where the deepest transformation takes place. You stop making excuses for behavior that repeatedly harmed you. You stop rewriting painful memories so that the relationship appears healthier than it actually was. You stop telling yourself that if you had been more patient, more loving, quieter, smarter, or more understanding, everything would have turned out differently. You begin separating responsibility from guilt. You recognize what belonged to you and what never belonged to you. Most importantly, you stop interpreting another person's lack of empathy as evidence that something was wrong with your ability to deserve love. Their limitations do not define your value. Their inability to treat you properly does not prove that you were unworthy of being treated properly. Once you understand that, the relationship begins losing its psychological power because you are no longer using their behavior as evidence against yourself. Eventually, you may notice something surprising. You no longer feel the same urgency to know what they are doing, whether they miss you, whether they regret anything, or whether they understand what they lost. Those questions once felt incredibly important because your mind was still looking toward them for resolution. But as your internal narrative becomes clearer, the questions lose their power. You begin focusing on what you learned, what you will never accept again, what boundaries you need, and what kind of life you want to create now. Your attention moves forward naturally. That is when no contact becomes more than a communication strategy. It becomes a psychological boundary. You are no longer simply refusing access to your phone or your social media. You are refusing to give someone permanent access to your thoughts, your identity, your emotional energy, and your sense of self. The strongest form of freedom is not making someone regret losing you. It is reaching a point where their regret is no longer necessary for you to feel valuable. You stop measuring your healing by whether they come back. You stop measuring your worth by whether they finally recognize what they did. You stop waiting for the perfect apology, the perfect explanation, or the perfect ending. You realize that some people may never give you the acknowledgement you wanted, and that reality no longer has to keep you trapped. Your life does not need their permission to move forward. Your healing does not need their participation. Your identity does not need their approval. And once you truly understand that, the psychological hold begins to disappear. You are no longer fighting them. You are no longer trying to win. You are simply choosing yourself so consistently that their ability to influence your inner world gradually becomes smaller and smaller until one day it is no longer central to your life at all. A narcissist's ego is rarely shaken by an argument, an exposure, or even your decision to leave. They can often reshape the entire situation in their mind until they are once again the victim, the misunderstood one, or the person everyone should be focusing on. What creates a much deeper disruption is something far quieter: genuine emotional detachment. Not silence filled with resentment hoping they eventually notice your absence, not distance used as a strategy to make them chase you. Real detachment is when something inside you simply stops moving toward them. You are no longer waiting for their reaction, their apology, their regret, or their return. Their behavior may still be something you remember, but it no longer controls your emotional state. That is a completely different kind of power because you are no longer trying to influence them. You are finally becoming unavailable to the emotional cycle itself. For someone who depends heavily on other people's reactions to feel significant, emotional reactions can become extremely important. Your anger tells them they affected you. Your tears tell them they still have emotional importance. Your confusion keeps you searching for answers. Even your attempts to repair the relationship can reassure them that you remain invested. This is why detachment is so much more powerful than simply disappearing. You can be physically absent while remaining mentally consumed by someone. You can block their number and still spend every night wondering what they are thinking. You can delete every photograph and still replay every conversation. Detachment happens when that internal movement begins to stop. Their name no longer immediately changes your mood. A message does not automatically create panic. Their silence does not send you into detective mode. You stop living in anticipation of their next move, and that is when their psychological influence begins losing its grip. Real emotional distance does not mean you suddenly forget everything that happened or become incapable of feeling. It means your feelings are no longer directing your behavior. You may remember the relationship without needing to return to it. You may feel sadness without turning that sadness into a reason to contact them. You may remember the good moments without using them to excuse the destructive ones. You may even experience anger without allowing anger to become another invisible connection between you. This distinction is important because hatred can still keep someone psychologically close. Constantly thinking about how much you dislike them still gives them space inside your mind. The goal is not to replace love with hatred. The goal is to move beyond both. Eventually, the person becomes part of your history rather than the center of your emotional present. Their existence no longer determines what you feel, what you do, or how you see yourself. That is why emotional detachment can be so difficult after a relationship built around manipulation and instability. You may have spent a long time monitoring their moods, predicting their reactions, choosing your words carefully, and trying to prevent another conflict. Your mind became trained to watch for danger. Even after leaving, that habit can remain. You may still wonder whether they are angry. You may still imagine what they would say about your choices. You may still feel guilty for doing something that once would have triggered their disapproval. But healing means slowly teaching yourself that their emotional state is no longer your responsibility. Their disappointment is not an emergency. Their anger is not your assignment. Their opinion is not a command. You begin returning responsibility to the person it belongs to. And with every moment you refuse to react automatically, you weaken the old pattern that once made their behavior so powerful. There is also a deeper reason why your detachment can change the entire dynamic. When you stop participating emotionally, the old feedback system stops working. There is no longer an immediate reaction for them to influence, redirect, or manipulate. The arguments lose their momentum because you are not trying to win them. The guilt loses its force because you are no longer desperate to prove that you are a good person. Nostalgia loses its power because you can remember the past without romanticizing it. Attempts to provoke you become easier to recognize because you are no longer experiencing every interaction as an urgent emotional event. This does not mean every person with narcissistic traits will react dramatically, or that you can predict exactly what another person will do. It means that your vulnerability to the old cycle decreases. Their ability to pull you into familiar emotional patterns depends partly on your participation. When you stop participating, the pattern has far less room to operate. Physical silence is relatively simple. You can block a phone number, you can remove someone from your contacts, you can unfollow their account and delete old conversations. Those actions create distance, but they do not automatically create peace. The deeper form of silence happens internally. It means you no longer spend your day wondering whether they will reach out. You are not checking your phone, hoping for a message, and then pretending you do not care when nothing arrives. You are not posting something because you secretly want them to see it. You are not imagining how they might react if they discovered how much your life has changed. You are not rehearsing a perfect speech for the day you finally meet again. Your mind stops preparing for an interaction that may never happen. That is when silence becomes meaningful. It is no longer something you are performing. It becomes the natural result of having moved your attention somewhere else. If you are still consumed by whether they miss you, whether they regret losing you, or whether they finally understand what they did, then the connection is still active internally. There may be no conversation happening between you, but there is still a conversation happening inside you. You might mentally defend yourself against accusations they made years ago. You might repeatedly explain your side of the story to an imaginary version of them. You might replay the final argument and rewrite the ending over and over. All of this keeps the psychological relationship alive. Emotional freedom requires you to notice these patterns without judging yourself for having them. Then, little by little, you stop following every thought. You do not have to solve every unanswered question. You do not have to understand every motive. Sometimes healing means accepting that certain questions will never receive satisfying answers and deciding that your life can still move forward. When you stop explaining yourself, another major shift occurs. You stop treating the other person's interpretation of you as something you must correct. In a dysfunctional relationship, you may have become accustomed to constantly clarifying what you meant, defending why you reacted a certain way, proving that your intentions were good, and trying to convince the other person that you were not the villain they claimed you were. Eventually, explanation becomes exhausting. You find yourself giving longer and longer answers, hoping that if you choose the right words, everything will finally become clear. But when someone is committed to misunderstanding you, more explanation does not necessarily create understanding. It can simply create more material for another argument. The moment you realize you do not have to win every accusation, you reclaim something important. You are no longer placing your identity in someone else's hands and asking them to approve the version of you that you already know is real. This is especially important because manipulation often works through endless confusion. A simple issue becomes a complicated argument. Your original concern disappears beneath 10 new accusations. You begin defending something you never even said while the original behavior is forgotten. Then another explanation is demanded, followed by another. You become so focused on proving your intentions that you lose sight of what actually happened. Over time, you can become dependent on the other person's approval simply because you are constantly trying to get back to emotional stability. But clarity does not always come from finding the perfect argument. Sometimes clarity comes from stepping outside the argument entirely. You realize that you do not need to convince someone who has already decided what they want to believe. You do not need to participate in every debate about your character. You are allowed to leave certain accusations unanswered. The urge to justify yourself can be difficult to release because it often feels like self-defense. You may think, if I just explain this one more time, they will finally understand. But when the same conversation repeatedly ends with you feeling smaller, more confused, and more guilty, the pattern itself is giving you information. You begin noticing that the objective was never mutual understanding. You were trying to reach resolution while the other person was trying to maintain control of the conversation. Once you recognize that difference, you stop measuring your communication by whether they agree with you. You can speak clearly without over-explaining. You can establish a boundary without presenting a 20-minute defense of why you deserve it. You can say no without writing an essay about your reasons. That simplicity is powerful because your self-respect no longer depends on receiving permission from the person who once benefited from your uncertainty. And as you stop performing for their approval, you begin discovering how much of your old identity was built around keeping the relationship stable. Perhaps you became the one who always apologized first. Maybe you were constantly trying to calm them down. Maybe you learned to ignore your own needs because addressing them created conflict. You may have become the person who absorbed everyone's emotional tension and then blamed yourself whenever something went wrong. These roles can become so familiar that they begin to feel like personality traits. You might think you are naturally a people pleaser, naturally anxious, naturally indecisive, or naturally responsible for everyone else's emotions. But sometimes these behaviors were adaptations to an environment where being yourself felt unsafe or costly. Leaving the relationship gives you an opportunity to ask a different question. Who am I when I am no longer trying to manage another person's reactions? Rebuilding yourself means answering that question through action. You start making decisions because they fit your values, not because they will prevent someone else's anger. You begin wearing what you actually like. You reconnect with interests you abandoned. You spend time with people who allow you to relax instead of constantly monitoring yourself. You speak honestly without immediately apologizing for having an opinion. You begin noticing what makes you happy without checking whether someone else would approve. These may seem like small changes, but together they represent something much larger. You are no longer living as a version of yourself designed around another person's emotional needs. You are returning to the parts of yourself that existed before you learned to shrink, explain, accommodate, and anticipate. The goal is not to become an entirely different person. It is to become more fully yourself again. This transformation can feel uncomfortable at first because the old version of you was familiar. You knew how to keep the peace. You knew how to anticipate problems. You knew which parts of yourself to hide and which words were safest to use. Freedom can feel strange when you have spent a long time surviving through adaptation. But eventually you realize that peace does not require constant monitoring. Healthy relationships do not require you to abandon your personality to keep someone stable. You do not have to make yourself smaller so another person can feel larger.